Hello, everyone. I'm Brian Wygal, and this is an introductory video to a series of lectures on the rise and fall of civilization. I'll be reviewing mostly the book by Chris Scarre, The Human Past, World Prehistory, and the Development of Human Societies. So just as an introduction to this whole series of lectures on the rise and fall of civilizations, or better described as complex societies, I want to introduce you to the field of archaeology and the relevance of archaeology to the collective knowledge of world prehistory. And in this series, we'll be looking at humans in a long-term perspective. So just as a way to introduce myself briefly, I am an archaeologist. I teach field method courses in Alaska. Here's a photo of the Holtzman excavation that I took a couple of years ago, where we bring students from all over the world in and excavate first American sites, or the earliest American sites as people were coming into the New World. So I teach anthropology and archaeology, and one of my favorite subjects is the long-term development of human cultural and technological knowledge and abilities. And along with that, the social evolution of our species, Homo sapiens. And in order to do this, we like to start in deep time and explore these types of questions. So archaeology, the study of the human past, goes beyond the written work, beyond history, and goes into the deep prehistoric past to provide evidence for past human lives, how people lived. The scope of archaeology goes back millions of years, so much further than a historical account, which would rely on the written word. That means that we begin this story with hominid evolution, or the evolution of our distant ancestors, and eventually fully Homo sapiens. That's what I mean by the long-term perspective. So we're talking about prehistory, or the time before the written accounts are available. So we're looking at the distant past. And as such, it's a long view of human cognitive and biological evolution. In a couple of these charts here, which I obtained through Creative Commons searches online, Google Images searches, and I've tried to reference the primary source as much as possible with some of these figures, but and some of them come from the textbook, The Human Past. But here are a couple that really summarize a long view in simple graphical terms, where in this phylogeny, we show the different points in time when our different primate species that you're familiar with today, the chimpanzee and the bonobo, the greater apes, orangutan, and gorilla. And then obviously in the center here, fully modern Homo sapiens. So we're going to, in the first series of lectures, explore these breakpoints or divergences between these primate species going back 4 to 6 million years ago with our story, but focusing, we'll move through those early years fairly quickly, the lower Paleolithic and the middle Paleolithic. And we really want to get ourselves to the upper Paleolithic, when fully modern Homo sapiens, our relatives, appear on the scene, and we see a fluorescence of cultural, technological, and creative knowledge emerge. We also, though, want to compare. It's important in this long view to compare the development of fully modern Homo sapiens with our very close ancestral cousins, the Denisovans and the Neanderthals. We do know that they were so closely related to us that genetic admixture, at least between Neanderthals and fully modern humans, did occur at different points in the evolution of fully modern humans, particularly over the past 200,000 years, and probably much of that within the last 50 or 40,000 years. So we see some admixture between Neanderthals and fully modern humans after the initial split out of Africa occurred when Homo sapiens left the continent of Africa and began moving into Eurasia. And then later in time, we see some genetic admixture between the Neanderthal and Denisovans, but also between Denisovans and Asiatic fully modern people in Siberia, and even some folks in Oceania carry genetic signatures. So this is a complex story, and probably best looked at as a evolutionary shrubby bush instead of the typical evolutionary tree like you see in the image on the right. So thank you for joining me on this journey. I hope you find it interesting. There are a lot of characters in this play of hominid evolution, and we build the story from the fossil evidence. Here are a lot of the characters that you'll be introduced to in this class, primarily those in the genus Homo, but we will talk a bit about our distant ancestors, Australopithecus, as well in this class. So you see it's a crowded field of different types of critters that we call hominid, or those that fall within the family of hominid organisms. So through time, and you see time marked on the top here, starting back at 7 million years ago and moving forward up to close to the present time, or what we would call the Holocene. So time is an important component of this story, and grasping where we are chronologically, how many thousands or millions of years ago, really is sort of key to understanding the trajectory of the evolution of ultimately our species. And in the bottom part of this slide, you can see the different geological epochs, which will factor prominently in much of these discussions. This particular chart goes way back to the Miocene, and then you have the evolution of the Pliocene primates, and then ultimately the Pleistocene, or the age of ice. And today we are in what is known as the Holocene, although given climate change, which we will talk about, many scientists are now calling our geological epoch that we're in now the Anthropocene. So we will explain some of those geologic epochs as we go through this course. But keep in mind that we're going to begin the class mostly in the Pleistocene and quickly get ourselves up to the late Pleistocene for the first module of these lectures. Then the bulk of the series will focus on late Pleistocene and early Holocene developments through plant domestication, technological evolution, and then much of what we'll talk about are the rise of what we would call socially complex societies. So that places us in this deep time that we want to talk about. And ultimately, we arrive at the present, where we have extremely dense population centers. Here you can see a picture from Los Angeles, one of the more densely populated cities that we have in North America, New York City obviously being one of the others. But you can see the complexity in this image, the density of the urbanism. So we want to talk about those factors as technological developments that allowed for this sort of human habitation to happen. We're going to talk about changes in the climate and how those impacted social and cultural evolution of our species. We're going to talk about migrations, movements of people, and with them, their ideas and their technology. we'll spend quite a bit of time discussing a long process, a lengthy process called domestication, or this relationship between people and other organisms in their environment, primarily plants and animals, and the process of taking their biological evolution under human manipulation or human control. Whether knowingly or unknowingly, this interaction between plants and animals and people resulted in the changes in the genotype of these species to such an extent that they become reliant on the behaviors of us for their survival. So in many ways, it's a symbiotic relationship that evolved, but it is a lengthy and complicated one, and we'll spend significant amount of time talking about that process in different parts of the world, ultimately resulting in this process of urbanization, or the development of dense, complex societies. And in many cases, in fact, in most cases, we'll learn that the rise of social inequality is part of the development of social complexity. Not that it necessarily has to be, it's just that that's what has happened. In most cases, we will look at one case in particular in the Indus Valley where there was less social inequality than we see in almost all of the other ancient civilizations. But social inequality is something we still have today. Social stratification, economic and social placement within society. What are the driving forces of those aspects of our present or modern culture that we live in and experience today? What are their roots? How far back in deep time does social inequality go? And do you have to have social inequity in a complex economic, social culture? Those are key questions that we want to explore throughout the course of this entire series. So let's start with climate change, just as an introduction to this class. Pleistocene geologic epoch is known as the age of ice, and it is a time of large-bodied megafauna, or large-bodied mammals that in the northern parts roamed primarily grasslands. So think of woolly mammoth, or the cave bear, the dire wolf. There were giant sloths and many other types of very large animals in different parts of the world. Australia had its own unique blend of megafauna species, and Northern Europe and Asia did as well. There are some similarities and unique species to the North American Pleistocene faunal assemblage of animals. By 700,000 years ago, there began a series of warm and cold climate fluctuations. So we would call these glacial and interglacial cycles. So when it's a glacial cycle, you have ice expanding from the northern polar ice cap, moving south down onto the subarctic and even into the temperate zones. The Great Lakes, obviously, in North America were carved out by expanding glacial ice to make those deep lakes. So that gives you a sense of how far south the ice sheets actually came. Some of these interglacial periods were longer and colder than others. Or some of these glacial periods were longer and colder than other periods. And some interglacial periods lasted longer in terms of the warming of the planet, or periods where that ice retracted. So it's important to associate glacial periods with cold ice expanse, expanding glacial ice, or think of them as an ice age. And those are interrupted by interglacial cycles where the ice is retreating and the planet is slightly warming. So you have these fluctuations in glacial and interglacial cycles. And on average, you'd have an ice age about once every 100,000 years. and they would last for quite a while. And then you would have these short warm trends lasting about 10,000 years in between them. And those numbers fluctuate greatly throughout this whole period that we know as the middle to late Pleistocene. So here is a chart that depicts the average annual temperature of planet Earth. And without getting too specific, this is constructed from proxy environmental records. One main source would be drilling into the ice caps of Greenland or into Antarctica. You could also take cores from ocean sediments as well. And in those archives are clues as to the actual temperature of the ocean water or the atmosphere. And so that helps us to create this whole history of climatic events, not weather, but climatic events through time. So on the left, you have here Celsius. Celsius measured based on the average of the Earth's temperature between the 1960s and the 1990s, and it gives you sort of this nice chart. Whereas when the line is higher on this chart, it's warmer, and when it's lower on this chart, it's colder. So a few things that you can see here. One at the far right, you have the Holocene optimum, where there's a lot of wiggling back and forth, but it's more or less stable in comparison to the rest of this chart. That's really the period where the Earth was relatively mild. It was obviously not as warm as it was during the Eocene period here, or even the early part of the Pliocene. But it's also not as cold as it was on average throughout the Pleistocene geologic epoch. So here we're talking about hundreds of thousands of years, and even on the left side of the chart, millions of years before present. So this is long geologic time being represented here. And what you can see is that humans really did begin to emerge as these complex, large-scale urban societies during the Holocene optimum climatic period. So after things sort of stabilized following the last glacial maximum, which occurred roughly 19 to 22,000 years ago. You can see the last glacial maximum on this slide right about here, with a gradual trend towards increasing warm climates by 15,000 years ago, a short return to glacial conditions during the Younger Dryas, roughly 12,000 years ago. And then the planet really does become this optimum climate. So if we zoom in just on the right side of this chart and take a closer look in this next slide, you can see this is the last 400,000 years ago, with the average temperature in Fahrenheit as the measure of the line. So again, the higher the wiggly line is, the warmer it is, and the lower that line is, the colder it is. So here in this chart, it is labeled as interglacial and glacial periods for you to reference in the last 400,000 years ago. Now, the interesting thing is that this is largely based on the percentage in parts per million of carbon in the atmosphere, which surprisingly, surprise, surprise, plays a central role in the temperature of planet Earth. Now, zooming into the a little closer here, the last 400,000 years ago, we're looking at parts per million, and in comparison to that previous chart of temperature, you can see that this chart shows on the far right this what's called a hockey stick pattern, where you have the parts per million going off the charts, like it's a very steep upward trend and going well beyond the historical level of carbon for the last 400,000 years ago. And this is obviously a direct result of humans burning fossil fuels, taking them from the ground and burning them and putting them into the atmosphere, which then causes the climate change that we're all familiar with today. Having a higher level of carbon and methane and other what's called greenhouse gases is essentially like putting a wool blanket around planet Earth so that it keeps that heat in and it can't radiate it out into space, causing problems with the thermal regulation of the planet, and it warms the planet up. So maybe this isn't a problem if you're in the middle of an ice age and it's the last glacial maximum, but when you're in a relatively warm or mild period, you don't want to keep turning the thermostat up too high, because it really does tinker with climate and causes extreme weather conditions. And what we don't really understand is what happens when it gets too warm for life itself. So those are important things to consider, that there are consequences to the activities that humans are now having collectively on planet Earth. So here's an interesting map from the polar perspective, the North Pole being at the center of these two maps. And you can see the extent of glacial ice from the last glacial maximum here on the left, the maximum extent of ice on a continental scale. Here, it's a lot of polar ice going down into the mid-continent of the United States, going as far as Long Island. And then you have today's continental ice, which mostly is centered around Greenland. It doesn't necessarily show the sea ice that is over the Arctic Ocean that fluctuates on a seasonal basis. So it's a lot of polar ice melt since the last glacial maximum, and we're seeing more and more of that today. Now, the point is that the land masses also change here. So on the left chart, where all that ice is locked up in polar ice, it's not in the oceans. So you see a larger landmass, particularly in the area of Beringia. These are the Aleutian Islands here, and this is Alaska. So Alaska is connected by land to Asia during the last glacial maximum because the oceans are lower in level. Now, when you melt that ice and it goes into the ocean, the sea level rises, and you see that that Bering Strait is now flooded with the Arctic Ocean. The Arctic Ocean connects to the North Pacific Ocean in today's map. Now, what happens when you melt what's remaining of the polar ice caps, Greenland and Antarctica, and you put that water into the ocean? The sea level goes up even further. And so then you jeopardize coastal low-lying areas with further flooding of ocean waters. So climate change has has impacted humans. It has influenced our evolution, and humans have adapted to often rapid environmental changes in the past. But rapid environmental changes on a geological sense is really quite slow when you compare it to the cultural climate changes that are anthropogenically generated. We're dumping so much carbon into the atmosphere that it's difficult for the natural processes to respond. And one of the consequences of that could be a mass extinction or a mass die-off of species that are unable to respond biologically to what is a cultural phenomenon. In short, the current climate change issue is much faster than a natural geologic climate change event. So in the past, what has happened is humans have adapted to different changes, the glacial and interglacial cycles, through their technology. They've invented tailor clothing, they've invented more and more sophisticated shelters, and they learned how to control and use fire. The ability to create campfires, to manage fire, really did allow our species, fully modern humans, which is a tropically evolved ape from Africa, to live in Siberia by 30,000 years ago. and our ancestors as well, Neanderthal, who used campfires to live in the frigid, cold, glacial periods of Europe at that time. So these technological innovations really did allow hominids to live in environments that they, in the case of modern humans, were not physically evolved to live in. So increasingly technical, tailored clothes were an invention of modern humans. It allowed us to live in more and more cold, further and further north environments, and to survive these Pleistocene interglacial times, which would not have been easy. We've mentioned anthropogenic climate change as a significant threat to human ecosystems. It is something that we all need to pay attention to on our daily lives and our behaviors. And so one key critical aspect of this series of lectures that I want to get across as we review these texts in different parts of the world are what lessons can be learned from the distant past. Can we look at past civilizations that flourished and succeeded and then failed? Can we look at the reasons for their collapse and understand what role did climate have in that? And what role did human behavioral systems, beliefs, inability to respond, what role did those have in the failures of ancient societies? And can we help to avert similar crises in our own modern culture? Deforestation has been a problem in the past. It's a problem today, and it's been a problem for past societies as well. Further and further reduction of forested environments, consumption of resources in the natural environment in an unsustainable way ultimately cause difficulties for economies and for cultural survival. So we'll look in places, say the Maya, for example, in Central America, in the Indus or Harappan in the Indus Valley, where cutting down the trees in an unsustainable way may have contributed to difficulties in maintaining their culture. Further reduction of pollution, packaging, single-use items is a concern of today. So we're going to look at consumption in the past. Obviously, they didn't have Poland Spring bottled water in ancient Sumeria, but we will look at the patterns of consumption in the past and compare them to what we are seeing on the planet Earth today collectively as a global society. We're no longer isolated into little regions. We are now a multicultural global society. Consumption and resource use and pollution are major structural problems facing the globalized world of today. Wasteful consumption. We need to reduce wasteful consumption. We need to redefine our consumer economy, and we need to invest in green economies and sustainable living, primarily because of the number of people that live and inhabit planet Earth, but also because of the impact that that has on our natural resources, our drinking water, the quality of our air, places that we need in order to survive as an organism. And also just to share this world with other animal organisms as well. We can't continue dumping the garbage into the oceans and into the landfill and creating these projects, these products like the styrofoam cooler you see here that don't break down. It creates a problem for life on Earth as we know it. Other forms of wasteful consumption reduced human causes of extinction for these animals. If we want to continue to see and share the world with the beautiful creatures that have evolved alongside of us, there are things that we just shouldn't be doing. I'll leave it at that. We need to curb greenhouse gas emissions. another form of wasteful consumption, the removal of fossil fuels from the ground and the burning of those puts them into the atmosphere. We have the technology to move away from greenhouse gas and fossil fuels. And if we want to continue to have air to breathe or temperatures that are amenable to life on this planet and not more like the planet Venus, which is super hot, hundreds of degrees Fahrenheit, and essentially inhospitable to most forms of life. We don't want to turn planet Earth into an atmosphere like Venus's. We want to be able to live here for generations to come. So these are things that we want to consider as we reflect on our own society, our own global complex society, and those things that occurred in the past. So in what ways can we look at human migration, transnational migration in the past? We can ask the question, from where did your ancestors come from? Where did they originate? How far back in time can you trace that lineage? And you, as you all probably know, there are multiple lineages that come down to form you as a biological organism. What can we learn about those different streams? Why do humans migrate? What are the causal agents that in some ways compel, in many ways compel people to move from one place to another? What are the difficulties involved in that, especially as populations increase throughout the long duration of the human experience? If we look further back in time, tens of thousands of years ago, we can talk about the initial peopling of the world, and not just by Homo sapiens, but by other hominid relatives like Homo neanderthalensis, or the Neanderthal, and even further back in time, Homo erectus, who spread out of Africa into parts of Asia. If you look at the area that's red here, you'll see that our species emerges in Africa, we'll say roughly 200,000 years ago. Biologically, that is anatomically modern humans. But at the time, we're just behaving very similarly to our cousin Homo neanderthalensis, who is already in Europe at that time, or just evolving out of their ancestors, Homo heidelbergensis, in Europe by 200,000 years ago. There are neighboring cousin species, and we're behaving much in the same way, making similar types of stone tools, making similar types of a living. It's just that Neanderthals evolved in the colder European climate, and fully modern humans evolved in the warmer tropical climate. So what is different between us? Why did humans migrate out of Africa into the territory of the Neanderthal and then essentially outcompete them and go on to colonize the entire world, whereas Neanderthals did not? They ultimately contribute some genetic material to humans when we encountered them about 40,000 years ago in Europe, or in Eurasia a little earlier in Southwest Asia. And why is it that Neanderthals are no longer here giving this presentation to you all, but Homo sapiens are? That's one key question we'll start off with early in this series. Now, I mentioned domestication, and we'll talk quite a bit about domestication. Sustained multi-generational relationship between humans, animals, or plants, wherein one group of organism really assumes a significant degree of influence over the biological reproduction of another organism. And in a sense, they take care of another group of animals or plants to secure a more predictable supply of that resource going forward. So there's a motivation behind this process. The new organism eventually becomes completely reliant on that caregiver, eventually to the point where it forms a new genome that can no longer exist in what we would call the wilderness or out in nature. They require human intervention in order to survive. So you see here the wild Pleistocene auroch is perfectly capable of surviving in late Pleistocene Europe, which is a rough place to live. He's big, strong. He's got huge horns for defense that most predators aren't going to want to mess with a fully grown auroch. Well, the Neolithic domestic cattle are similar to the auroch, but they get smaller and they begin to lose those horns. And several interesting things happen. They're not as smart. On one hand, they don't have to be, because humans keep the predators away. Their horns get smaller. They get smaller so that they're less dangerous to the humans. They also get less aggressive and more docile over time. So these are some characteristics that are bred into the population that are favorable to human propagation of that species, but less favorable to that species in the wild. They no longer really have to defend themselves against a pack of dire wolves, for example, because humans will keep those predators at bay. So a new organism eventually evolves through that manipulation by humans. There's many scenes of plant and animal domestication in action. This is from ancient Egypt. Keep in mind that this is a lengthy process and that people didn't necessarily just say, I'm going to domesticate an auroch today. It probably was a process that occurred over generations, and that was not a specific decision by any one individual. So how do we go from early plant and animal domestication to urban cities? When did the first urban centers emerge? What new types of social organization are required? What new types of culture must we have in order to be a fully urban type of society? These are far more complex economies than the past, but we begin to see this progression towards urbanization in some parts of the world beginning 5,500 years ago in Southwest Asia, and a little bit later in other parts of the world. So we're going to look at that process in particular. We'll look at plant and animal domestication, and then we'll look at the process of urbanization, the first cities. Why did they emerge? How come in one place you start to see cities pop up, but in others, they're still living a Paleolithic way of life, of hunting and gathering with relatively few people on the landscape? These are interesting questions. I find them fascinating, and I hope you will too. Today, half of the world's population live in cities. For example, 80% of the population is urban in the US and in Europe. In Australia and Japan, 90% of their populations live in urban cities. We look at the population growth from 1750 as projected to 2100, you see an annual growth rate of the population around the world. So we're projected to really start to plateau above 10 billion people. Towards 11 billion people, we'll begin to see this plateau of the world's population for a variety of reasons. As the world becomes more urban, people tend to have fewer children because they're more expensive. In part, they're more expensive to have in urban settings. So there are many complicated driving factors that lead to this. Agricultural societies tend to have, in rural areas, tend to have more children per individual than people living in cities do. And we'll look at the reason why that is. Can the world sustain 11 to 12 billion people? At what point do we reach some sort of a earthly carrying capacity for our species? Social inequality, as we mentioned. This is the disproportionate distribution of wealth and power among people. You see in ancient Egypt the extremes represented by these luxurious tombs and palaces. We see the arrival of prestige goods, in particular gold. We'll look at some of the earliest burials containing gold. Extensive burial goods, lots and lots of material wealth that is inheritable, and apparently that you can take with you in ancient Egypt if it's put in your tomb, and you can protect it from tomb raiders later on. We begin to see a ruling elite, a class of people that are in charge, in power, and have the bulk of the wealth and power. And we see larger portions of the population that are less prosperous citizens. Why do you have urban poor and slave classes in society? Who came up with this plan, and why was it invented in the first place? And are they necessary for there to be, quote unquote, civilized society? It doesn't seem very civilized to enslave another population, a group of people. It doesn't seem very civilized to have people that live in poverty, that do not have sufficient access to clean water and nutritious food. These don't seem like civilized decisions to me. Why do they exist? How did they emerge? So we want to look at the roots of the initial development of what we would call social stratification. It used to be that in the Upper Paleolithic, we lived in generally egalitarian societies. That is a society where everyone was more or less equal within society. They had equal access to resources, and they shared. Why is it that we moved away from that form of social organization? We don't see that in urban cities today. Complex societies in general of the modern world are not egalitarian societies. It is a symptom of urbanism. And it's a rising concern in Western society as we begin to really see a large difference between a super rich class and a lower class. There's a greater and greater what we would call wealth gap in Western civilization. We want to recognize the conditions under which social inequality first appear. We can look archaeologically for evidence of the degree in which differential access to wealth and influence and prestige appears in the archaeological record. We want to see the degree to which wealth is inheritable or passed on from one generation to their offspring. If you have a society where a child can be buried with items that are perceived as valuable, such as gold, then you know that child did not acquire that wealth during their lifetime, that it was inherited presumably from their parents. Here you can see the Varna burial, which we will talk about later in another lecture in this series. The Varna burial is one of the first appearances of gold in a burial setting. So, in short, to sort of close this out, social inequality, we have it because cultures accept it. We have the development of social, political, and symbolic structures that support socio-political and economic stratification within our society. And it's arranged differently in different parts of the world. In some places there are formal caste systems. In other places you cannot move from one social class into an upper social class, no matter how much education you receive. In other societies, you are able to move between social classes, but how realistic is that, and how difficult can it be for the majority of people? What are the structures, the social structures that are in place that keep people from moving between social classes? Archaeology studies these patterns of growing social inequality through time so that we can better understand those processes as they occur today. We can look at the egalitarian societies of the Paleolithic hunter-gatherers to the super wealthy kings and pharaohs of ancient Egypt, ancient Sumeria, and the beginning of social inequality in human societies. And we want to trace that path up to the modern day. So what are the responsibilities of archaeology as a discipline? This is sensitive information. It's dealing with people's cultural patrimony. It's investigating the ancestry, the cultures, the traditions of different groups of people. Archaeology needs to be sensitive toward descended communities that are being studied, the ancestors of people that are being investigated, or if possible, are being studied. We have today community and indigenous archaeology that involves the local descended groups, whether that's Native Americans or Irish farmers in Northern Europe. We can ask the question, who owns the past and who has the right to interpret it? Do you need a PhD in archaeology to be able to tell the world of its human past? Probably not. So we see the evolution of archaeology as a discipline over the years. And it's important to note that it is inherently political in its nature. So while we are a social science that wants to apply the scientific method to investigating the human past, it's really not that simple, because you have to take into account the wishes and the beliefs and respect their the individual rights to tell their own story of their origins and of their history. And those need to be taken into account as much as any scientific process. Other responsibilities are collections management. What do you do with the artifacts when they're collected? How are they treated? In particular, the treatment of human remains and the wishes of descended communities, which vary from place to place on how those may be displayed and discussed, or if they are to be returned to their place of internment through reburial. Should they be given back through the process of repatriation of either human remains or cultural items? These are all political things that are in the process of really being sorted out by working with local communities to understand our human past in a way that we can collectively tell this story that it belongs to all of us. We are reflecting on our present and our future through learning more and more about the past. So I thank you for your attention in this lecture, and I hope that you tune in for subsequent talks on this subject. Most of this will be based on the Chris Scarre book, The Human Past, 4th edition. As we get later into this series, I'll be using a book by Joseph Tainter on why societies collapse. When we begin to look in the third section or module of this series, we'll study the reasons behind collapse of social complexity. So I thank you all for your attention.